Dear moderator, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, the Director General of Trends Research and Advisory. Thank you for joining us, and I'm honored to be kicking off this very exciting symposium titled Presidential Elections 2020 and US Shifting Policies Toward the Middle East. Trump or Biden? That's the question the world is asking with around a week to go for the United States elections. The Middle East has historically been extremely significant for the US, as peace in the region has major implications for maintaining global power balance. The region's significance stems from political, strategic, economic, and security considerations. The outcome of these elections, scheduled November 3rd, will, to a large extent, define US policies toward the Middle East in the years to come. With this in mind, we have organized this significant symposium and gathered our esteemed experts here today to foresee the prospects of change in the US policy toward the Middle East. We would be exploring subjects such as the US policies and their fixed and changeable trends, how Trump and Biden view the challenges facing the Middle East, and their perspectives on the Gulf security. The session will also focus on an important topic, which is the newly elected president's approach toward political Islam movements and the Muslim Brotherhood. On behalf of Trends Research and Advisory, I thank all the panelists, the moderator, and the viewers from all around the world who have joined us today to participate in this session. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I give the floor to our evening's moderator, Mr. Jason Campbell. Mr. Jason, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Jason Campbell. I'm with the RAND Corporation in Washington, D.C. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. This is truly an international effort today, and I'd like to thank Trends for inviting me to moderate a really impressive list of speakers. As was said at the outset, we have 5 topics today with 6 speakers. The way we'll do it is we'll just have them go in succession, and I will break in and introduce the topic as we proceed. To give a quick overview of who we have with us today, first, Mr. Jonathan Furziger, a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, followed by Mr. Yossi Klein Halevi, senior fellow with the Shalom Hartman Institute. Then Dr. Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, Dr. Ann Speckhart, the director for the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism, Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, the Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute, and then finally Professor Klaus Laris from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So without further ado, I will give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Jonathan Furziger, who will speak for about 15 minutes on how the candidates for the US presidential election view issues in the Middle East. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks very much to Trends Research for organizing this session. It's a pleasure to be with you today. There was a moment at the White House last week that pretty much summed up why Donald Trump is truly one of a kind. It certainly distinguished him from his Democratic opponent, Joe Biden. There he was in the Oval Office announcing the normalization agreement between Israel and Sudan. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is standing behind him, along with son-in-law Jared Kushner and a dozen other staffers, while Trump sits at his desk talking to the foreign leaders on a conference call. We hear Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu come on the line, and the president says, "Do you think Sleepy Joe could have made this deal, Bibi?" Somehow I don't think so. Well, so much for diplomatic protocol. Of course, Netanyahu deftly managed to sidestep the trap of getting pulled into American politics. His response, well, Mr. President, one thing I can tell you is that we appreciate the help for peace from anyone in America. and we appreciate what you've done enormously. Well, let's analyze that. The key words for the purposes of that call were the last ones. We appreciate what you've done enormously. There is no question that Trump has done a great deal over the past 4 years to merit Netanyahu's appreciation. And being Trump, he wants to hear Netanyahu say it. While I was talking about the dramatic but extremely delicate Sudan deal, Trump's question can be applied across the Middle East landscape. This president has in so many ways changed the way American foreign policy addresses the Arab-Israeli conflict and the process of trying to make peace. On many issues, he's given Netanyahu almost everything he's ever wanted. In contrast, Trump has completely alienated the Palestinians, who are fervently praying that he loses next week. If Trump wins re-election, those policies will largely continue. A second term might even give him leverage to bring the Palestinians into the equation somehow and pull off the so-called deal of the century that he hasn't been able to clinch so far. As we saw at the US-sponsored conference in Bahrain last year, investors were standing by, offering to pour some $50 billion into the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem if the Palestinians come on board. On the other hand, a second Trump term could reinforce the sense of hopelessness that one finds among Palestinians today. It could catalyze a wave of violence that would not only destroy hopes for ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but force all other parties to duck for cover. When the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem is seen to be under threat, it is likely that cooperation with Israel will again be seen as poisonous across the Arab world. It will be interesting to see if Emirati officials like Ambassador Youssef Al-Otaiba in Washington, who were architects of rapprochement with Israel, can insulate the Abraham Accords against such a threat. The challenge for Netanyahu, and perhaps for the UAE's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed as well, is that Biden could win. That's what most of the polls show. So Netanyahu has to take the possibility of Trump losing into consideration in anything he says that could widen the policy gap between Israel and the Democrats. So when Netanyahu said the words, "We appreciate the help for peace from anyone in America," it was clear he was paying close attention to the polls that indicate the Trump show may be on the verge of being canceled. One principle that both Israel and the Gulf states have been successful at cultivating over the years is bipartisanship. The idea that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. That when it comes to the United States, you try to maintain strong ties with both Republicans and Democrats. This is the principle that's going to be tested next week. If Biden wins, how do Arabs and Israelis play the US in a post-Trump world? What I'd like to do is run through how Trump has addressed the major Middle East issues while he's been in office, and take a look at how Joe Biden might tackle them if he becomes president. Let's start with the Abraham Accords, because frankly, I wouldn't be talking to you from Israel today. I'm in Jerusalem if this groundbreaking diplomatic agreement hadn't happened. So we'll discuss the US role in Israel's agreements with the UAE and with Bahrain, as well as where things may go with Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states. And behind all this diplomatic activity is the issue of Iran. It was the threat of Iran developing a nuclear bomb that more than anything brought Israel and the Gulf states together. After Trump pulled the US out of the joint international agreement with Iran that the Obama administration negotiated, Biden wants to rejoin it. I'm touching on this because it lies behind everything else, but my friend Yossi Klein-Levy will go into this further in his presentation. We'll also talk about the Palestinians and whether they may come on board in a Biden-led peace process. So how do we measure the Abraham Accords in relation to the American elections? At least at this stage, we're seeing the advent of broad political, commercial, and people-to-people connections between Israel and the UAE, as opposed to the chilly government-to-government relations that have always characterized the treaties with Egypt and Jordan. This is a signature foreign policy achievement for President Trump, and one that he would really like to turn into votes. The problem for Trump is that it doesn't seem to have made many Americans change their minds about him. By and large, foreign policy doesn't play a very significant role in how Americans vote. The coronavirus and unemployment and racial divisions between blacks and whites carry much more weight than what happens here in the Middle East, or for that matter, in Russia and China. Trump is popular among Orthodox Jews and evangelical Christians, but those preferences are already factored into the American political calculus. Polling shows that somewhere between 70 and 75% of American Jews vote Democrat. That's quite a contrast with the sentiment here inside Israel, where some 63% of Israelis say that they hope Trump gets reelected. It's also important to recognize that Muslim voters in America favor Democrats. 71% say they'll vote for Biden, 18% for Trump, according to a poll by CAIR, the Council on Islamic American Relations. Jews, though, represent only about 2% of America's population of 330 million. Muslims are just over 1%. The biggest pro-Israel voting bloc is the evangelicals, who comprise about 20% of Americans, and roughly 85% of them are likely to vote for Trump. That's a lot of numbers. So how does Biden compare with Trump on the Middle East? Here's something Biden said that sums up what we may expect if Netanyahu continues as prime minister. Politicians love to display autographed pictures on their walls of all the foreign leaders they've met. Biden says he once got a request for such a photo from Netanyahu. He sent it back with the following inscription: Bibi, that's Netanyahu's nickname, I don't agree with a damn thing you say, but I love you. He said that. Does he really love Israel's prime minister, who has always been a lightning rod for controversy? I don't know. Biden's a pretty affable guy, but the fact that he says they don't agree on anything is certainly an indication that we could be headed into a renewed era of confrontation. It was pretty clear after 8 years that President Obama and Netanyahu did not love each other. As far as Israel's relations with the Gulf, Biden welcomed the Abraham Accords and will probably try to expand them if he becomes president. The question is how this is going to shake out for the next phase involving Saudi Arabia. Unlike Trump, Biden is likely to bring up questions about human rights with the Saudis and sharpen US criticism about the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. This is something that was finessed by Netanyahu and earned him points in the Saudi royal court. When he was asked about Khashoggi's killing in Saudi Arabia's Istanbul consulate 2 years ago, Netanyahu said, quote, "What happened was horrendous and should be duly dealt with. At the same time, it is very important for the stability of the region and for the world that Saudi Arabia remains stable." That pretty much expresses how Trump looks at the Gulf as well. He's always made the point that US-Saudi relations are basically transactional. Trump is not one to lecture other countries on their human rights behavior. Biden, at least Biden the candidate, says the opposite. Quote, "Under a Biden-Harris administration, we will reassess our relationship with the Saudi kingdom. I will defend the right of activists, political dissidents, and journalists around the world to speak their minds freely without fear of persecution and violence." There are clearly going to be some difficult moments with Saudi Arabia if Biden becomes president. So another area where Trump has dramatically changed US policy is in dealing with the Palestinians. Among the actions he has taken was recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the US embassy there from Tel Aviv, which is where most countries keep their diplomatic presence in Israel. The US Congress passed a law in 1995 to move the embassy, but the action had been postponed every year since because US presidents thought it would touch off a violent Palestinian response, even lead to Armageddon. It took Trump to do it anyway. In the end, the embassy move provoked a lot of international diplomatic protests and rioting in the Gaza Strip, but not the extreme explosions of violence that had been predicted. Biden says he's not going to reverse the embassy move, though he will probably take steps to patch other things up with the Palestinians. Those could include restoring some of the foreign assistance money that was cut off by Trump and allowing them to reopen the diplomatic office in Washington that Trump ordered shut down. Another Trump signature move was recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. This was one more step that many had warned would lead to violence, but again, it didn't happen. As long as Syria remains a pariah and maintains its close ties with Iran, a Biden administration probably won't want to inflame the issue and try to reverse Trump's action. Here's the big question. What would a revamped Middle East peace process look like under Biden? Trump's innovation was essentially to take the Palestinians out of the equation, to make a peace proposal so radioactive, so stacked in Israel's favor as to make it impossible for Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas to accept. Once Trump's proposed agreement was unveiled last January and rejected by the Palestinians, it cleared the way for the real deal making to advance with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, and with other Gulf states, which culminated in signing of the Abraham Accords. Among the ingredients of the Trump deal is that the Palestinians would get their own state, but that Israel would annex about 30% of the West Bank, where most of its Jewish settlements are located. If Biden is elected president, it will be a challenge for Netanyahu to walk back an offer that the Israeli settlers have already pocketed. It certainly seems like another round of likely stalemate, similar to the last real round of peace talks under Secretary of State John Kerry that broke down in 2014. The prospects are slim for Biden being able to push Israel in the opposite direction after Netanyahu was given a White House stage last month to declare that the old formula of land for peace is dead and buried. On the other hand, there could be some new variables that would help Biden in addressing the Middle East if he wins the election. Among them is the prospect of new leadership for the Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas is 85 years old. He's a smoker with a heart condition, and it's likely that he will be replaced in the next 4 years. Among his possible successors are younger Palestinian leaders who may show more flexibility than Abbas has demonstrated in negotiating with Israel. Another variable is the prospect of the Gulf states actively promoting a solution to the conflict with Israel, whether it's through financial support or actual participation in the negotiating process. Direct Gulf involvement in the peace talks could be a game changer. To sum up, the stakes for the Middle East going into next week's election are very high. The differences between Trump and Biden are night and day. Whatever the results, they will likely have profound impact on the region's most pressing conflicts involving Iran, the Palestinians, and Saudi Arabia. Trump may call him Sleepy Joe, and Biden may have some deep affection for Israel's prime minister. But in terms of Mideast foreign policy, if Joe Biden wins next Tuesday, we should pay attention. We should pay attention to the words he wrote on his photo with Netanyahu when he said, "I don't agree with a damn thing you say." Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And with that, we will move both to our next speaker and in our next topic, perspectives of the U.S. presidential election candidates about Gulf security. And for that, we will begin with Mr. Yossi Klein Halevi from the Shalom Hartman Institute. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Greetings, everyone, from Jerusalem. I'm delighted and deeply moved, really, to be with you on this significant. Thank you for having me. I'd like to focus my remarks on the implications for Iran policy, the future of what we had thought, and I'll speak as an Israeli, what we had hoped was the moribund Iran deal. What are the implications of either a second term for Trump or a Biden-Harris administration I'm saying Biden-Harris deliberately because I think that we're going to see if there is a Biden administration, that Kamala Harris is going to be one of the most significant presidents in American history. I think she's going to be playing a major role. Her relationship to Middle Eastern issues, I believe, will be crucial here. In terms of Trump in a second term, there has been a kind of a low level, but nevertheless persistent anxiety in Jerusalem about the temptation for Trump in a second term of going for his own version of an Iran deal. And given the North Korea precedent, there really is some concern that I wouldn't call it major concern, but it is a topic of concern that that Trump might be tempted to go for his own version of a grand or a grandiose deal with Iran, and with perhaps some changes, cosmetic or otherwise, in the original deal, but not necessarily deviating fundamentally from that deal. I think personally that the people around Trump, if they remain more or less the same constellation, I think there are built-in limits to how far he can take this. But I do think it's necessary to put on the table the possibility of a Trump version of an Iran deal. Again, not likely, but as far as Biden and Harris, there will be no surprise there. They are on record proudly affirming their support for the Iran deal, their conviction that scrapping the Iran deal, major mistake, not least for Israel and Gulf. And if you pay attention to some of the op-eds and statements that have been coming out of the Biden camp, written especially by former Obama administration officials, hailing the Iran deal and promising a return to the deal, and claiming that the deal in the end harmed Israeli and Gulf security by allowing Iran to resume nuclear production. That's the line that's coming out most strongly from the Biden camp, that's being aimed at pro-Israel voters, at the Jewish community in the US. I personally think it is outrageous. I think it is a profound distortion of reality, but it gives us a window into how the thinking is taking shape in the Biden camp, and what we can expect from the administration. Now, the question really is how much of a priority is renewing the Iran deal going to be for a Biden-Harris administration? And secondly, what kind of deal will Iran too be? And I speak of that as a foregone conclusion, especially if, as is expected, if Biden and Harris win, they will likely win the Senate as well. The Democrats will win in the Senate. And so the sense among pro-Israel groups in Washington, and Jonathan Shanzer can certainly speak more authoritatively about this than I can, but my sense from a distance is that the expectation is that the Iran deal, in one form or another, will be resurrected. In terms of how much a priority it will be, foreign policy in general is not likely to be a a Biden-Harris priority. Jonathan Ferziger spoke about the Obama administration. You may all recall that on literally the first day of the Obama administration, the president appointed George Mitchell, special envoy on the Palestinian issue, signaling that this was going to be a top priority for the Obama administration. Things didn't quite work out the way the Obama administration had hoped. Nevertheless, I think that we won't see anywhere near that same sense of urgency on Middle East issues generally from a Biden-Harris administration, which is probably good news for regional security. I do worry that President Obama will have an outsized influence on the next Democratic administration. And for Obama, the Iran deal was his preeminent foreign policy achievement. It is the foreign policy equivalent of Obamacare. And so for Obama, certainly, resurrecting the deal will be a priority, and I think we need to prepare for that. In terms of what kind of deal to expect, the Democratic Party, as many of you no doubt are aware of, is going through some profound transformations. The progressive wing is growing. It has not yet taken over the party. Nevertheless, we need to pay careful attention to the progressive wing. It is on the wrong side of all of the issues, the security issues that have brought together, that have made the Abraham Accord possible. For the progressive wing, the great villain in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia and Israel. Iran is not a villain. Iran, if anything, is potentially a positive force that needs to be cultivated. It is the old Obama administration approach, but much more intensively. And so what we need to do, and when I'm speaking we now, I mean the UAE-Israeli alliance, specifically on how to deal with a Democratic White House and Senate, and how do we navigate the complexity here. And the first thing we need to do is really something that Jonathan touched on in his presentation, which is return to a bipartisan model for this relationship's position in Washington. The Abraham Accord is perceived in America as being a Trump administration achievement that will create some complications for us in moving forward with the Democratic administration. I don't believe insurmountable difficulties, but we will certainly need to be paying closer attention to Democratic Party sensibilities. And here I would say that the UAE-Israeli alliance on Iran needs to focus on several points. First is we need to propose together publicly a credible alternative to the Iran deal. What is the Iran deal that the UAE and Israel are prepared to live with? Because we need to work on the assumption that if the Senate and the White House are Democratic, the Iran deal in one form or another is going to happen. And so we need to think about what are our red lines, what are our absolute security needs, how much of the nuclear infrastructure can we credibly advocate dismantling, what are the credible inspections policy that need to be imposed, drastically expanding the sunset clauses, monitoring malign Iran behavior, ensuring as much as possible that Iran leaves Lebanon and Yemen and other of the Arab countries that it is implicitly or explicitly controlling, canceling the ICBM program. These are the demands that I think we need to be placing. We need to be in a position where we are not denying the need for an Iran deal, but we need to try to help shape the Iran deal. And here we need to enter into the internal Democratic Party debate between the progressives and the moderates and determine who our friends are in the Democratic Party and what is a credible Iran deal that they can live with, that we can live with as well. More broadly, how the UAE-Israeli strategic alliance against Iran needs to deal with the return of the Democrats to power. First of all, I would say we need to present a credible strategic vision. And here I mean an alternative strategic vision to the Obama administration's vision, which placed Iran in the position of a potentially positive force. Iran, as Obama made clear, would be a positive force for regional stability. We need to make clear that there is a new force for regional stability, and that's based on the Abraham Accord. That is the real strategic message that we understand that that's what is motivating, in large part, this alliance. We need to make that explicit to a democratic America. They need to understand that what has happened here in this historic peace agreement has a significant strategic argument that is a counterweight to the failed Obama vision of Iran as a regional stabilizer, when the last 5 years have proven exactly the opposite. That's the case we need to make strategically. The last point that I'll offer is that we also need, when we're dealing with the Democratic constituency in America, we need to present a vision that has moral credibility. With the Republicans, frankly, the moral component is much less significant. With the Democrats in power, we are going to have to address the Palestinian issue in a credible way. And I very much appreciate, Jonathan, you're raising that point, and I think it's significant. The two Israelis on the panel are bringing up the Palestinian issue. There is no way with the Democrats in power that the Palestinian issue can be circumvented. And I would certainly join with Jonathan in saying that I don't believe the Palestinian issue should be circumvented. I'm delighted that the Palestinian leadership no longer has a veto power on peace agreements in the region. Nevertheless, I want to fully endorse Jonathan's vision of the Abraham Accords as being the first step toward a regional peace agreement that will bring in the Palestinians, that will cultivate, if necessary, an alternative Palestinian leadership, but that will present the Palestinians with a credible alternative to where we're heading now. Thank you.
Thank you, Yossi. And with that, we will remain on this topic of perspectives of the U.S. presidential candidates about Gulf security. And our next speaker is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be with you all today. And I want to actually congratulate my Israeli and Emirati colleagues for some recent diplomatic achievements, really remarkable times that we're living in. I want to thank Trends for having me here today. What I thought I would do is to speak very broadly about some of the kind of sweeping issues that I think both a Biden or a Trump administration may need to deal with, and then also deal with the question of the policy with regard to some of the, or to all of the individual Gulf states as well. Of course, all of this is subject to some change depending on the way that the vote turns out with both the Senate and the House. You could find a Biden or a Trump administration hindered in part when you have that healthy tension, in my view, in the American system, where there are different parties in control of the executive and the legislative branches. It's unclear, of course, which way we're going on this, but I'll try to address at least in some cases where that tension could be brought to bear. First, I'd like to just speak for a minute about normalization. Obviously, we've already heard Jonathan and Yossi talk about normalization, and I've probably not a whole lot more to offer in this regard, but I do think that it's worth noting that we're likely to see under Trump the continuation of the outside-in approach to peacemaking, looking at the peripheral Arab states and focusing on those, and perhaps focusing less on the Palestinian demands, traditionally, I would say Palestinian intransigence. However, what we can also say with some certainty is that the Palestinians have been holding out on the Trump administration. They have been waiting to see what happens in November in the hopes that they don't have to deal with Trump. If in fact Trump wins, it is, I would say at this point, a foregone conclusion that the Palestinians will have to come hat in hand to a Trump administration and begin to negotiate directly. In which case, that could really upend the dynamic, or it could reinforce it, for that matter. I mean, the way that we've typically viewed this is that Trump has maintained a certain amount of leverage over the Palestinians by working with these peripheral Arab states. What we could see is sort of a combination of both, outside in and inside out. I don't necessarily think that that would be any less effective than what we have seen to date, although, of course, there would be, I think, considerable concern in Jerusalem about a Trump administration deal with the Palestinians that would cede more than the Israelis would be willing to allow. But at any rate, that I would say is the calculus on the Trump side. On the Biden side, I think the outside in and inside out approaches are a foregone conclusion. We will see a return to this traditional model. I think the only difference really is that the Biden administration now would see the benefits of trying to woo countries like Oman or Kuwait, or even Qatar for that matter, into this new regional construct while maintaining a certain perspective on the orthodoxy of dealing with the Palestinians and Israelis as well. So that leads me to the next. I mentioned Qatar. I want to briefly touch on the question of Gulf unity. I think that this has really been swept under the rug in recent years. And of course, in the first year of the Trump administration, it was a major issue. The rift that erupted between primarily Bahrain, UAE, and Saudi Arabia on the one side and Qatar on the other. Initially, it did seem like the Trump administration was taking sides. I recall some tweets that the president issued where he sort of took a few swipes at the Qataris. I would say that that has largely not been part of the Trump administration policy over the last 4 years. It really has, I would say, had secondary or even tertiary importance. Although I would note that on the same day of the signing of the Abraham Accords, the Trump administration did announce that it was requiring Al Jazeera Plus, AJ Plus, to register as a FARA entity, which clearly was a nod to the Emirati side of the Gulf spat. But I think moving forward, I think we can expect the Trump administration to probably continue to relegate this to a secondary or tertiary priority. Where a Biden administration, I think we would probably see a real focus on this. I think that from what I understand from the Biden advisors, they see this as a problem. They see it as something that detracts from American power in the region, and that they would look to try to paper things over at minimum. What I would say personally is that I actually think that this is a healthy tension within the Gulf. I don't welcome an enduring split, but I do think that the differences between the Gulf states are significant enough that we should be addressing them. Notably, Qatari support for groups like the Taliban or the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas. I think that it's very positive that the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain would be opposed to these policies and would be pushing back on the Qataris. And so it's my hope anyway that if there are efforts launched by either a Republican or a Democratic administration, that we get to the heart of these issues and not just paper things over for the sake of moving on. We've already heard quite a bit about Iran from Yossi and Jonathan. Let me just add my 2 cents. I certainly think that we'll continue to see max pressure from the Trump administration. And I think, as we saw yesterday with additional sanctions, there is still room to run on max pressure. I think there is still additional pressure that can be placed on this regime, and they are certainly feeling the impact. The concern that I think you'll hear from certain quarters in Washington, and certainly, as Yossi mentioned, from Israel, is that we could see the Trump administration move toward direct talks, and those direct talks would carry significant risk. You could see an eagerness on the part of the Trump administration to make certain concessions in order to ink a new and historic deal. And of course, the Iranians have been quite adept at besting their American counterparts, as we saw between 2013 to 2015. With the Biden administration, I think we will almost certainly see sanctions relief. We're already seeing this in the form of some memos that have reportedly been circulating among Biden advisors. And I would say that the key here, as Yossi pointed out, is the question of personnel primarily, this question of the progressive wing versus the sort of pragmatic wing of the Democratic Party. I think there is still an arm wrestling match that is going on within the Biden camp, and who prevails will ultimately determine whether a JCPOA 2.0 is any better than 1.0. But I think that the key right now, quite frankly, is the recent developments that we've seen in terms of diplomacy in the Arab world. I believe that right now, the Gulf and Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and others have an opportunity for the first time to really speak in one voice in opposing certain concessions that may be made by the United States in the course of negotiations. This was lacking the last time around. The last time around, I heard from some of my Gulf friends and other Arab friends that they were largely supportive of the speech, the controversial speech that Bibi Netanyahu gave at the joint session of Congress opposing concessions to Iran, but they were unable or unwilling because of political reasons to come out and say that they supported Bibi's opposition. Now I believe there is an opportunity for all sides to come together and to make certain demands, and to, I think, probably first and foremost, demand that they have a say in whatever negotiations are going on, and that more importantly, all issues would be on the table for a new negotiation or a new deal. In other words, that would include not just missiles and not just the nuclear issues, but also the regional destabilization that we know that Iran has been involved in, as well as terrorist support and proxy activity. All of these things that should have been on the table in the first place, that really the lack of that discussion led to a very myopic deal on the nuclear issue alone, as opposed to dealing with the range of issues that I think should have been addressed, and no sanctions relief, in my opinion, should have been given until they were addressed properly. So I think there are some new opportunities owing to the regional normalization trends that we've seen, and I think that's quite positive. Now, briefly on the Muslim Brotherhood, I think this is another issue that is very important to the Gulf, also happens to be very important to the Israelis. It has been an issue that has popped up repeatedly during the Trump administration about possible designation of this group. I have written about this on a number of occasions, having studied it quite a bit and worked on it a little bit at the Treasury Department. The Trump administration continues to indicate that it would like to designate the entire group. I still don't believe that that will be possible. I believe that they can take a step-by-step approach in identifying the violent groups, the ones that have demonstrably engaged in terrorist activity, and begin to designate accordingly. And I think that that is still a very real possibility under a second Trump term. It's just a bureaucratic process that the Trump administration would have to basically commit to, and it has not done so to date. I do not believe under any circumstance the Biden administration will pursue that kind of Muslim Brotherhood strategy, or any Muslim Brotherhood strategy for that matter. Democrats have been rather unanimous about their opposition to doing this for fear of upsetting large populations in the Arab world and perhaps stoking a new Arab Spring or some other uprising that the US would have a hard time containing. I don't lend a whole lot of credence to that argument, but I still don't see the Biden administration moving in that direction. Two other things on the regional level before I get to the states. Yemen, I think, is going to loom large for both administrations. I think it continues to be a huge problem, and it is a Gulf problem, to be clear. However, I still see that the Trump administration reflects a certain indifference to what's happening in Yemen. I think in large part because this does appear to be a somewhat intractable conflict, although I do think that the Trump administration has a real opportunity to apply additional pressure to the Houthis, at least in respect to sanctions and other perhaps diplomatic pressure. With the Biden folks, I think this is where we're going to see probably the greatest significant shift or difference between the two administrations. I believe that the Biden administration will want to focus on ending this conflict and placing significant pressure on the Saudis in particular, and to a lesser extent, the Emiratis, and congressional pressure, particularly here. If we see Democrats sweep the Senate as well, you will see significant pressure put on the Gulf to end this conflict, and perhaps even significant pressure on a Trump administration if there is a split. I'm not sure how likely that is, but I think that this will be a significant issue to watch, where we could see real differences in administration. Finally, there is the question of overall force posture and what the United States might do in terms of military deployments around the Middle East that would impact the Gulf. Look, the general trend in the United States right now is one of isolation, unfortunately, in my view, because I think it will have a negative impact on American security long term. But I would say that the Trump administration is seized, in fact, with this idea of recalibrating force posture and moving our troops out of the Middle East, whether it's Iraq or Syria or even the multinational forces in Egypt. I believe that this will have a real negative impact on relations between the Gulf and the United States, perhaps the broader Middle East and the United States. And I do believe that the Gulf, together with Israel, much like what we saw with the Iran deal, there are opportunities for the Gulf and Israel to speak in one voice, to engage with either a Democrat or a Republican administration on this question of force posture, offering up ideas, creative solutions to maintain a certain posture, because as soon as the United States leaves, this certainly will open up opportunities for more mayhem caused by Iran or other bad actors in the region. Very briefly, it looks like I've got about, 7 minutes or so left. I want to just briefly talk about the individual countries and how we may see some changes in terms of American foreign policy. I'm going to lump in Oman and Kuwait in kind of one bucket. These are two countries that are, I don't want to say in flux, but they certainly, they're now in the midst of some change after leadership changes. I don't see major changes within either administration on either of these countries. I do think that there will be a temptation for a Biden administration to engage Oman again as a possible so-called honest broker if there is a renewed Iran peace process or negotiations process. I think that this would be a problem for Oman. I think it already served as a problem for Oman. It's so distrust within the Gulf Alliance, within the GCC. There was a lot of distrust among some of these Gulf states because the Omanis were hiding this from their Gulf partners. And I don't think it was obviously a welcome development given how the JCPOA turned out. So I think that will be something that could come up during a Biden administration. With Kuwait, there is a continued terror finance problem, which I believe is going to be tackled in a bureaucratic way. I think it will be something that both Democrats and Republicans address probably in equal measure, and I certainly hope that they do. With Qatar, I think this is the big question mark. They have already indicated that there is a possible interest in normalization with Israel. They have already put in their request for the F-35. I think that this should not happen without demands for major reform from either Democrats or Republicans. I don't know how much of an appetite there is for this. I would say, typically speaking, Democrats and Republicans continue to turn a blind eye to Qatari malign activity throughout the region. And by this, I mean support for Hamas, support for the Taliban, support for the Muslim Brotherhood, even groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so it will be very interesting to see whether there is a significant change in either administration over this. But certainly I do think that there is an opportunity now that the Qataris have at least floated the idea of normalization along the lines of what the Emiratis and the Bahrainis have just done. If there are going to be concessions, and I certainly would not endorse F-35 or any other major American hardware, I would say that there's an opportunity to finally address these behavioral challenges that the Qataris have historically exhibited and to use this as leverage. On the question of Saudi, this is, I think, where we're going to see the biggest rift. And I think we've already heard our two speakers at least address this in some shape or form. It is very clear to me that Democrats, the center of gravity within the Democratic Party, they wish to punish Saudi Arabia for the Khashoggi affair, as well as, I think, Yemen. Republicans, I think, are a bit more transactional and are probably more willing to engage, certainly to talk about arms sales and other ways that Saudi and the United States can cooperate. I think that peace with Israel is an interesting question and could potentially start to smooth out some of these rough edges, although I think there will be real questions about what Saudi Arabia will get in return for such a deal, because of course there will always be an ask with either president. And certainly here again, looking at the makeup of Congress, I think this will be hugely significant if Saudi Arabia tries to move forward. If Democrats have the edge in Congress, they could make things extremely difficult for the Saudis. But I do think that no matter what happens, they are still going to be looking for some, let's just call it, truth and reconciliation on the Khashoggi issue, as well as some of the purported war crimes and allegations coming out of Yemen, which have really rankled many Democrats in Congress. Finally, I'll just end on UAE and Bahrain. I think these are the two countries that we see probably the most stable foreign policy across the Democrat and Republican divide. I would say that the Yemeni operations for the UAE was probably the biggest challenge, and I think we see that receding to some extent. I think that both Democrat and Republican administration would view the role of Bahrain and the UAE in normalization with Israel as a sign that they could rely on these two countries again for additional deals and working through them through their good offices. And to be clear, I don't believe that the Biden administration would shun regional normalization just because it was something that the Trump administration started. I think that Biden has already indicated that he sees these things as very positive, that he would like to build on them. Of course, this is how presidents get Nobel Prizes. I'm not sure that Donald Trump will be granted a Nobel Prize for his efforts, but certainly I could imagine that a Biden administration might want to try to build on the successes that we have seen over these really miraculous few months. For the UAE, obviously questions of F-35 and the Israeli concerns over qualitative military edge, those things still linger. I don't think we'll see significant changes across administrations. There is signs, I guess, that the Israelis are softening on this to a certain extent, but I don't think that this is a done deal by any stretch of the imagination. I think there are still issues to hammer out. But from all accounts, I see both of these countries very much on the right path with American foreign policy and see stability in their future, no matter who becomes president. But overall, I think that generally speaking, the Gulf has really been, they've identified with the Trump administration foreign policy. I think we see a lot of trepidation about a return to Biden foreign policy where things were a bit more stormy. The Obama years were not great for the Gulf. And so this is the thing that I continue to hear, is that they don't want to go back lock, stock, and barrel to where we had been before, but hopefully to open up a new chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And with that, we will move on to our next speaker and topic. Dr. Ann Speckhart, the director for the International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism, will give us some thoughts on the attitudes of the presidential candidates towards the political Islam movements and the Muslim Brotherhood. Dr. Speckhart, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. And I'm sorry I joined late. I was a popular speaker today. I got asked to speak 3 different times. So sorry about that, but it's nice to see familiar faces, and what a great brief, Jonathan. Thank you for that. I'm a counterterrorism expert, so mainly study ISIS, Al-Shabaab, militant jihadi groups. But here's my try at this. As far as Trump on ISIS, we saw President Trump viewing the territorial defeat of the caliphate and the death of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as a complete and total victory against ISIS. I think most of us know that's not true. ISIS is still very active virtually, and there's quite a few fighters on the ground. And this viewpoint has in some ways led to devastating consequences. We saw the US troop withdrawal from northeast Syria, from the border with Turkey, and the incursion from Turkey against our Kurdish allies. So the SDF was pulled away from fighting ISIS in order to fight Turkish-backed rebels and to ensure their survival, and entered into an agreement with Damascus, which may not actually be good for what the US wanted. And it definitely has implications for all the ISIS prisoners that they're holding. There's been a great deal of instability. Isa detention camp where women and children were held was destroyed by bombing, and we saw women escape. One of them, Lisa Smith, made it all the way back to Ireland. Her country came and got her from Turkey, but there were Belgians that escaped and made it into Turkey, and there's others that have escaped that we don't know where they are. And we also saw that when the SDF was under this pressure, that there were increasing escapes, smuggling escapes from Al Hol camp, which continue to this day. So we see ISIS currently gaining ground. I'm not saying territory and supporters, not only in the Middle East, but also all over Africa. And the Trump administration is pulling troops out of Africa, which allies say hurt our counterterrorism efforts. So with all of these groups, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, we see them with their franchises around the world, and we see them moving fighters around the world. So, do we want to keep the pressure up or not? It looks like with Trump, he wants to crow victory, and may or not be actual victory. Certainly we did defeat ISIS territorially. The other thing that's been a boon with President Trump for propaganda for ISIS is his attacks on Muslims, the so-called Muslim ban. Those both served as propaganda to argue that America is at war not only with ISIS, but with Muslims in general. Likewise, we saw with the Trump administration a return to support for torture, increased use of Gitmo, and that again allows ISIS and other terrorists to degrade the US, I hope, moral high ground. We know that President Trump was endorsed by Kayla Mueller's parents, and there was a great deal of pride in extraditing 2 of the Beatles to be tried in US courts. This is interesting, just like the Supreme Court nominee, that Trump and Pence previously criticized the Obama administration for trying terrorists in US criminal court rather than in military courts. But it's looking like that's what will be done with the Beatles, rightly or wrongly. I think it's probably right to try them in US courts. As far as what we can expect from Biden on ISIS, he's advocated keeping small special operation forces and using airstrikes to fight ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. Biden strongly criticized Turkey's incursion into Syria and called Trump's betrayal of the Kurds shameful, as did many other politicians. And we saw some retirements that happened as a result. Biden is in favor of banning torture and closing Gitmo. And the Biden platform regarding terrorism, it emphasizes also the importance of fighting domestic terrorists. And that's something where we've also seen Trump be quite an insider with his statement of stand down to the Proud Boys. I guess, not only looking at ISIS, but also the far right, which Trump has been accused of inciting. So Trump and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Trump administration, as Jonathan so rightly said, and I think Jonathan is a much better expert on this than I am, but the Trump administration tends to lump the Muslim Brotherhood together as a monolith. And many people do this. But in fact, in Kuwait, we've seen evidence of the Muslim Brotherhood being vocally pro-American. In Iraq, we've seen their political party supported American-backed political processes, and we've seen them be part of a governing coalition. In Yemen, we saw the Muslim Brotherhood-linked party cooperating in a war against a faction believed to be backed by Iran. And we see the Muslim Brotherhood making up recognized political parties and US allies, including Morocco and Indonesia. So I totally agree with Jonathan that if we want to go after them, we have to do it step by step, a process, and figuring out, who are violent actors and who are not. And so far, we haven't seen the Trump administration have the stomach for that. And when they talk about designating the Muslim Brotherhood as an entity, as a monolithic entity, we see the support basically pushed from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, who look at elections by the Muslim Brotherhood as a serious threat to their stability, which is understandable. Biden on the Muslim Brotherhood, I think we can expect that he'll follow the Obama's administration of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was more nuanced, recognizing that it's different in different places and sometimes even backs American goals. But, of course, there was always the concern that in places, if there were democratic elections, that Muslim Brotherhood would sweepingly win. And then the question is, will they then dismantle democracy, which is a legitimate concern, and I'm sure will continue to be a concern with the Biden administration. When we look at Trump on Iran, we saw the strike on Qasem Soleimani, and it was claimed to be in response to an imminent and known attack, but there's not good evidence for that. And the strike led to a counterstrike by Iran, or Iranian-backed militias, on US forces who suffered traumatic brain injuries as a result. And Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal has allowed Iran to build up a nuclear stockpile, which is, of course, concerning. Biden has pledged to rejoin the nuclear deal if Iran returns to compliance, and he's criticized the strike on Soleimani, calling it an enormous escalation without a practical plan in place. Although he did agree, as most US politicians did on both sides, that Soleimani should have been brought to justice. So, not that this is a good guy we shouldn't have attacked. When we look on Trump on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we see continued support for right-wing policies in Israel, including moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem and supporting continued settlements. And this has enraged the Palestinians and decreased hope among them for eventual peace or any possibility of a two-state solution. And support for these policies has undermined, in some degree, peace with Jordan and Egypt. So that's concerning. Trump cut humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, increasing feelings of oppression and hopelessness, and this too can be exploited by terrorist groups. Peace brokered with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates does not have any clear implications for lasting peace in the region. These countries were not in any active conflict with Israel, and they had been cooperating under the table for some time. Annexation of the West Bank was paused as a result, but not taken off the table, leading the Palestinians to feel betrayed by both Bahrain and UAE. Biden has affirmed his support for Israel and for a two-state solution, which is increasingly looking like it's never going to happen. Biden has said he won't move the capital, the US Embassy, back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem, which is a great loss of beach property, I have to say. Biden opposes settlements and annexation and has called for more aid to the Palestinians. But Biden is opposed to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, saying that this veers into anti-Semitism. And Biden has called on Palestinian leaders, absolutely rightly, to stop the glorification of violence, which they do constantly. So that is my best take on these issues. But I have to say that I have stepped out of my area of expertise because what I know best is ISIS. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Those were remarks for a quasi-expert, I guess, on this. And with that, we'll move to our next speaker and topic here. Ambassador Alberto Fernandez from the Middle East Media Research Institute will give us some of his thoughts on the prospects of probable change in U.S. policy towards the Middle East region. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Trends, the good friends at Trends, for inviting me and for putting together this great panel. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm at a loss a little bit because being one of the later speakers, I've learned a lot from what others have said, and I agree a lot with what many of you have said. So I face the challenge of trying not to repeat or echo what you've all said, and kind of I've scratched out things that have already been said, and try to focus on some topics that maybe weren't touched as deeply as they should have. Of course, when you say about the prospects for probable change in the Middle East, it related to policy, it depends on who wins. And as I think as many experts have said, it does look like that the Biden, the Democratic camp, has a lot of advantages and has a good possibility to win. But that's not a sure thing in politics. There are many variables here, and even though the Democratic Party seems to lead in many of the polls, we could have surprises in next week as we had 4 years ago. I think there is one constant, kind of underlying constant, which hasn't been mentioned, and which needs to be highlighted, and that is that there's always, I think, underlying, no matter who the winner is, there's a basic truth to keep in mind, despite the internationalist rhetoric we hear from administrations, including especially from the Democrats and the Democratic ticket, that there's a dynamic in the United States, deep, I think, in the psyche of the American people more than ever before. It sees the Middle East as kind of a lost cause, which sees as a kind of a waste of American time and money, which has already exacted a heavy cost over the past 20 years, almost 20 years. Kind of a perceived drain on American interest and efforts and resources. This exists on the left and on the right. I think it's more on the right. It's more, obviously, it's a plank that exists in kind of a Republican worldview of how they see things. But it does underscore everything that we've discussed. Is a kind of, in a very sincere way, America wants to not leave the region, but lessen its footprint in the region. And we've talked about, Jonathan talked about the question of force posture and U.S. military presence in the region. But it's a temptation which exists, which will continue. It doesn't mean that either administration, either a Biden administration or a second Trump administration, would leave or abandon or ignore the region. But it does mean that there's a temptation to look at resources being moved elsewhere, to look at attention being moved elsewhere. And that kind of temptation will continue. It'll be an unspoken but very tangible reality underscoring relations with the region, and especially with rising or contending powers who are fighting each other for dominance. This means that there's an opportunity for these countries, big countries with complex issues, whether this be Turkey or Iran or Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Egypt. There's going to be room for maneuver for them in a way, no matter which administration gets in, for them to try to push things which are important in their agenda. They can somehow fit in with this kind of American perception that says yes, these things are important to us. Yes, we want to engage with you, but we have a limited bandwidth to focus on these issues. We have limited attention span. We have many issues that we want to deal with. So we want to work with you on these issues. Obviously, a second Trump term would see both continuity and change. Much of the continuity we know, focus on supporting our traditional Arab allies, focusing on strengthening the position of our ally Israel, confronting Iran, trying to manage, I believe, badly our relationship with our rogue NATO ally Turkey, which I think will loom larger in a future administration, whether a Republican or a Democratic administration, how to deal with Turkey, how to deal with Turkey's actions. We think of Turkey, obviously, for example, the State Department of Turkey is not part of the Middle East. It's part of the EU Bureau, not part of NEA. But for our purposes, and obviously for people in the region, the role of Turkey looms large in the region. And it will certainly be something that will be of great importance, even in a second Trump administration, but especially if you get a Democratic administration. Whatever plans have been discussed, I think there's going to be a reality that's going to affect both sides, and that is that whoever the winner is, no foreign policy plan survives intact when it encounters reality. That old statement of the German General von Moltke in the 19th century about military plans. The situation in the region, in my view, is so fraught. Leaving aside some success stories like the Abrahamic Accords, the region is in such dire shape, and I'm talking especially about the Arab world outside the Gulf, that there's a real possibility that an administration is going to be dragged in ways that it does not see itself doing today. Very much as happened with the Obama administration in 2011, when it left Iraq and found itself 3 years later back in Iraq, back with military forces in Iraq to combat the rise of ISIS. So what was supposed to become a pivot to Asia actually became a pivot back to fighting the global jihadist movement or menace in the shape of the Islamic State. And given the dire political, socio and economic trends that we see in the region, again, outside the Gulf, the possibility for sudden and even violent change in the region in the next few years, I think, is quite high. You look at the economic situation, and a country like Lebanon is a small country, but it's a kind of bellwether of situations what you could see happen in other countries in the region as well. And so I think that's something that needs to be very much in our mind, that no matter what careful plans the administration has, no matter, for example, how much a Biden administration may want to focus on these big foreign policy issues that they've enunciated, a return to multilateralism, a focus on global climate change, kind of drawing together of a community of democracies. These are some of the things that are in the Biden plan to kind of try to present a different view of how it would do diplomacy than the way the Trump administration is. There is a high risk that they will be tracked. Either administration will be dragged into kind of dealing with fires that they are not ready to deal with right now. I think also the question of bandwidth is one, again, that has to be addressed. Given the very ambitious goals that especially the Biden administration has in foreign policy, there's going to be a real question of bandwidth of how this is actually they're going to be able to deal with, given that a new Democratic administration will have an initial heavy lift on the domestic side, overwhelmingly. With COVID and ambitious socioeconomic and political re-engineering, political issues internally being a priority, and you add climate change, you add the embrace of multilateralism, you add some sort of democracy promotion, plus Russia, plus China, and then whatever disaster needs immediate attention, there's not going to be a lot left over to focus on the region, aside from kind of the regular way you deal with things. One thing which has been mentioned, which is I think very important, is a kind of the triangular struggle that would exist in a Biden administration between the big high-ticket issues that would require presidential attention, things like climate change, things like multilateralism, and the struggle that will occur between those who want to kind of recreate the foreign policy of the Obama administration and a younger cohort of ultra-progressive ideologues, and, to be frank, junior-level Islamists, American Islamists, who will, without a doubt, be brought in at a kind of working level as young, activists and people who worked on the campaign. This is American politics. This is a reality. As they burrow into the administration, as the administration develops, as it becomes younger, it will become more progressive. And this is uncharted territory, not just for Americans, but for the region. It's something that we don't know how that kind of progressive foreign policy writ large will actually develop on the ground. You can see it in different ways because there are certain questions. For example, a Biden administration would no doubt be tougher, as we've discussed, be tougher on Saudi Arabia, without a doubt, but also on Egypt, but also on Turkey. It would probably be, as has been discussed, certainly much softer on the Palestinian issue and embrace the Palestinian leadership, the current Palestinian leadership, and probably be softer than the Trump administration on political Islam. But the question of what is tougher and what is softer, what that actually means, that is something that's going to be have to hash out. For example, given the Trump administration coddling, what many of us see as coddling of Turkey, one would expect a harder line by the Biden administration on how to manage Turkey, how to push back against Turkish aggression, Turkish projection of its power in the region. But how do you manage that with, for example, the challenge of Russia, the challenge of China, the question of Iran? Turkey has a connection to all these issues. How do you harmonize being tougher on Erdogan with a possible kind of rapprochement that a Biden administration would have with political Islam, when many of the prominent political Islamic organizations, including the Muslim Brotherhood, are strongly supported and connected in one way or another with the kind of Ankara-Qatar axis? So there are a lot of kind of internal contradictions in what, for example, what a Biden administration might do, when it are not exactly clear in that how they would turn out. I think there's also a temptation. A lot has been discussed about Iran, and I think it's been very wise that the idea that Israel and the Gulf states, the UAE, have a real opportunity to kind of try to reshape the kind of the parameters of what is most important on Iran. I think there's also a temptation that will exist. It's a trap for a Biden administration on these other issues which are not related to Iran itself, but which are connected to Iran. I mean, the kind of issues of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Iran's proxies in those places. This obviously was a great lacuna, great thing which was not done with the JCPOA, but it's really something to look at. The danger of a kind of proposing some kind of grand bargain. By the way, the danger of a grand bargain exists both with a second Trump administration and with the Biden administration. But I would say when it comes to Iran and kind of Iran's friends in the region, the danger is greater that a kind of a Democratic, a Biden administration would be somehow tempted by kind of a grand bargain that would somehow normalize or entrench the presence of Hezbollah, the presence of Assad, the presence of pro-Shia parties. They're not going anywhere, but would certainly deepen them in a very real way. I think there's a real opportunity. We mentioned Yemen, and I think that is certainly a priority that you would see in the Democratic administration. I would say that there's going to be interest in looking at Yemen, looking at Sudan, and looking at Libya as well. if you, for example, if you were to get someone like Susan Rice as Secretary of State, she has strong connections to Sudan, strong connections to a specific outcome happening in Sudan. This is both a risk and an opportunity for countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to work as useful partners in finding a kind of shared outcomes that would be good for these countries and for the United States. So I think there's a danger, I think, especially when we talk about a Biden administration, to look at it as a threat to countries in the region that have prospered or done well in a Trump administration. And that may be true to a certain extent, particularly, say, with Saudi Arabia, and I would say perhaps to a certain extent Egypt. But there's also opportunity, because there are other issues that a Biden administration and even a Trump administration, but especially a Biden administration, would care about, where these countries can be either spoilers or facilitators. And that's certainly true of, say, UAE in Yemen. It's true of the Gulf states in Sudan, making sure that Sudan transitions by 2022, as it's supposed to, into a democratic state, and Libya as well. So these are opportunities. Also with Egypt, the whole question of the relations with Ethiopia and the Nile Dam and all of that. So it's not just these guys are going to come in, they're going to be a threat to our situation, but there's a real opportunity, given the limited bandwidth, given the big issues which either administration is going to face, particularly a Biden administration. There's a real opportunity to engage and influence in ways that are mutually helpful to our friends in the region and to the United States. Thanks.
Thank you, Alberto. And with that, we will move on to our last speaker of the session here, Professor Klaus Laris with University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill will speak on U.S. policy towards the Middle East, fixed and changeable trends. Professor, the floor is yours. Sir, I think you're still on mute.
I'm very sorry. I just said it's nice to be here, of course, and it's a pleasure to see all of you here. I just said I can cut it down to 1 minute because everything has already been said. It's very difficult to say anything new. What I had prepared was really Biden's approach to foreign policy and Biden's approach, of course, to the Middle East as well. First of all, I would like to say, and I will keep it short. First of all, I would like to say that I do expect a landslide victory for Biden. I think I appreciate the ambassador was a little bit more careful, doesn't quite know what, of course, no one does. But I think when we look at the polls, when we look at the tendencies, we can conclude that it would be very difficult for Trump to be re-elected. Also, I think from purely anecdotal evidence, so when I drive around the countryside in North Carolina, you see lots of Trump and Pence signs, much to my surprise. But on the whole, I think there's a general disillusionment with the America First attitude. I think people have become cynical about that. That is at least my impression. If I'm correct, that means then, and the Senate also goes Democrat, that means for the first 2 years, Biden administration would have a relatively free hand. And I fear that that free hand might, again, like Obama did to a large extent, might be wasted or might be used for domestic affairs. I think Biden's first attention is really to undoing much of the Trump legacy and realizing some of the domestic issues which he deems important. tax policy, immigration policy, that of course has a foreign policy dimension, environmental policy, race relations would be part of it, but also pushing through an infrastructure program, a healthcare program, and perhaps something about the Supreme Court, what we call court packing. I can see that that really will occupy a Biden administration for a significant amount of time during the first 2 years. And of course, there still is a COVID-19 pandemic. And here I think Biden probably will try to organize and coordinate that more globally than has been attempted by Trump. Though, of course, he is probably in the fortunate situation that a vaccine will probably quickly be come onto the market, will be distributed. So his challenge regarding the pandemic is perhaps much less great than anyone feared a few months ago. Excuse me. That I don't think that foreign policy will be uppermost in his mind. And when he looks at foreign policy still, I think he first of all will focus on relations, on the multilateralism, on alliance relations. Here, relations with the European allies will really be at the top of his thinking. He has justly criticized that the Trump administration has neglected that significantly. There was even rumors to withdraw from NATO. And I think he would see it as his first priority to get that back on keel into a normal policy. And Biden, of course, is I would say, old-fashioned policy hang who has been around for over 40 years. So that would also fill in with that. You know, in the 70s, 80s and 90s, of course, the European allies were still much more important than they are today. But I can see that he would be hankering back, at least partially, to that sort of period. And then the next foreign policy issue after dealing with the European allies and NATO, I think would clearly be China and Russia. I think any future American president, also if Trump were able to continue, would really have to do something about China. And my personal hope is that Biden will be more capable of entering into some sort of constructive relationship where things can be negotiated, can be talked about much more so than has been done recently during the Trump administration. But I think that we really would occupy much of his time. Then, of course, relations with Russia, and again, that is a European, but also a Middle Eastern problem, would be high on the agenda. And again, I think Biden is old-fashioned enough that Russia is still, you know, in the back of his mind as the Cold War Soviet Union. There would be, I think, an expectation that China and Russia will be very high up on his foreign policy agenda. It depends, of course, who is the personnel in his administration. I also would say that Susan Rice stands a good chance to become Secretary of State. And I think Tony Blinken would stand a good chance for becoming National Security Advisor. And I think both would be excellent choices. I'm not quite sure how the personal chemistry between Blinken and Rice is, whether that would work out. We know from past administrations, not least also Democratic administrations, that often the relationship between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State has been poor or difficult. And this, I think, may also plague a Biden administration. But what we can see in general is, I think, a greater predictability, and also, however, the idea that the United States is no longer the policeman of the world. So I think, like Trump, though a little bit perhaps wider, Biden will focus on certain areas of the world. He will be more selective. I don't think he will try to do it all. And the areas I've already mentioned are part of that. And regarding the Middle East, one can ask, so will there be no new Middle East policy at all? If he focuses on domestic policy on China, Russia, Europe, is there really much energy left? And to some extent, I think this is probably true. I would agree with what was said before, that the Middle East is not an area of the world Americans, including American governments, are keen on dealing with. And these are difficult problems. These are, in the American view, difficult, complex people. and blood and war is always round the corner, as is corruption, as ethnic, tribal competition. So it's it's a minefield. No one really can succeed. And I think that will characterize the Biden administration to some extent, that they will not be keen on hopping into the Middle East to sort it all out. So their grand strategy, or their grand bargain, as many people have called it, I can't see that the Biden administration would try to embark on that. And and here also in the Middle East, I can see that the Biden administration would be selective. They would not try to have that grand bargain, but would be focusing on certain countries, certain areas. First of all, I think the Iran deal. And I think Biden has promised so often that he wants to rejoin the Iranian nuclear deal that he now cannot not do it. So I think he will have to do that on certain conditions, of course, that is, as he says, full compliance by Iran. But I think Iran, despite what is coming out of Iran, that they would only start negotiating if sanctions were kind of immediately lifted. I think there is a readiness by Iran to start negotiating with the new American administration. Also the European allies, and here I think the good connections with, between Europe and the Biden administration would really come in handy, because there will be strong pressure on the part of the Europeans, but also, of course, China and Russia to try to renew the Iranian nuclear deal. Of course, the attempt will be made to improve the deal, not just to go back to the 2015 deal or the same or very similar conditions, but to be to at least include the so-called sunset regulations, so that there will be a longer period of time when it can be expected that Iran cannot achieve nuclear missile status, to put it that way. And secondly, of course, the regional problems. Iran's geopolitical behavior in the region will need to be addressed. I think that has been announced to some extent by Biden or his advisors in some of the speeches he gave. And there will, of course, also be pressure by the other countries in the Middle East, not least Saudi Arabia, to do something about Iran's regional behavior. And that, of course, will be highly difficult. But Iran, as far as I can judge, Iran seems to be suffering so much from the sanctions. Its oil industry has almost been destroyed, that it may actually enter such a new deal if it can be done with a safe phasing device. And here I'm optimistic that the Biden administration, together with the other signature countries, would dream up some sort of safe phase-saving device, which would allow Iran to, change the treaty and adhere to the treaty in that wider way. Then, secondly, there's the relations with Saudi Arabia. And Biden, I think, is personally appalled by the murder of Khashoggi. He makes personally the Crown Prince, MBS, responsible for that. So I think that would be a very difficult relationship. But in the last resort, oil is still important, and also the strategic situation of Saudi Arabia in the region is highly important. So I can see that there will be no real rupture in American-Saudi relations. It will be a cooling period. It will not be as intimate as, for example, Kushner was able to have relations with the Crown Prince. But I think after a year or two of I think I can see that relations with Saudi Arabia will really stay where they are largely. So there will not be a departure from Saudi Arabia, so to speak, regarding the Biden administration. While Biden will be much more critical towards strongmen in the region and elsewhere, that of course also applies to MBS, but I think strategy, oil, and simply the importance of Saudi Arabia in the region will override that. And hopefully, if an Iranian deal can be achieved, which may be acceptable to Saudi Arabia as well, that will make things a lot easier. That leads me to Israel and Palestine. And here I think Biden, of course, wants to go back to a two-state solution. He wants to integrate the Palestinians much more. He doesn't want to sacrifice them, as has been done by the Trump administration, essentially. But I can only see, and of course, Biden is a religious man. He appreciates the Jewish people. He has always said he is pro-Israel and strongly pro-Israel, and has really proven that over the previous decades. But I can see that only some improvement in relations can be made in a post-Netanyahu age. That while Netanyahu is still in office, I'm not sure that relations with Israel would really be all that fruitful and productive. Once he leaves office, I think the Biden administration would feel much more confident that something, a newly formed relationship with Israel is possible, which includes the Palestinian issue and the two-state relations. Regarding Afghanistan, it's difficult to judge. I would say that a Biden administration will stick to what the Trump administration is now negotiating, a withdrawal from Afghanistan and an agreement with the Taliban. I cannot see that Biden has any taste for allowing American troops to stay or even sending more American troops into the region, including Afghanistan. And of course, if he sticks to the deal which has now been negotiated by the Trump administration, I think he can always then, if something goes wrong, he can always blame the Trump administration for having negotiated the deal. And I can't see that he will actually change that substantially. And that leaves, of course, the relations with Iraq and also, of course, the difficult relations with, or in Syria with the Kurds, with Turkey, with Russia. And to be honest, it is very difficult to predict what will happen there. And I would have no real confidence to make any precise predictions. The only feeling we have, or the knowledge we have, is that Biden has in the past was torn between military force and military activities and not doing so. He was opposed to the surge, but for example, he wanted to send troops to Ukraine in 2014. So he's not a pacifist, but he's not a liberal interventionist either. And I would say, I cannot see that something like a surge or wholesale new commitment of American troops to that region of the world will happen at all. Maybe he will fall back on the Obama administration's drone warfare, that will be what also a Biden administration will pursue. And of course, that is also what Trump did to a large extent. But I cannot see a further commitment by Biden administration. So in summary, let me conclude by saying that the Middle East will not be the center of Biden's attention, perhaps with the exception of the Iranian nuclear deal and, depending on circumstances, of the Israeli-Palestinian matter. He will focus in foreign policy terms on Europe, China, and Russia, and other parts of the world will be neglected, at least initially, or will have a much lower standing in the priority list of the administration. And also, of course, relations with Africa, which are so important in view of the Chinese competition and rivalry, or relations with India, right now where Pompeo is in India. They are, of course, important and they will not be totally overlooked, but I cannot see that they will really get that much importance. Apart from the allies, it is really still China which will occupy a Biden administration for most of its energy regarding foreign policy. And the Middle East, unless something dramatic happens, I cannot see that the Middle East will be of particularly high priority to a new Biden administration. But people here know much more about it than I do, and they may all heartily disagree with me.
Well, Professor Lares, thank you very much for that. And to all of our speakers, I see here we are remarkably just about right on time for where we were supposed to be. And with 6 speakers, that is certainly in Washington a rarity. So as moderator, I'll take full credit for keeping the trains running on time here. As we go into the Q&A session here, we've got about 20 minutes. A number of questions were sent to me that were emailed to Trends before the event, so I'll do the best I can to kind of place them in the proper context of the respective offerings that have been presented today. First, just from my perspective, just a general question is this theme has come up in most, if not all, of your remarks. Ambassador Fernandez, called it bandwidth, which certainly shows his career in U.S. government as a former Pentagon staffer. Bandwidth was always something we were concerned about in terms of prioritization and where you can spend your energy. And as we look at the Middle East, three of these big issues came up. The Iran deal, and Biden's likely inclination to try to rekindle that, and certainly in the context of building multilateralism and other alliances. We've got Gulf unity, the issue with Qatar and on one side and the Saudis and Emiratis on the other. And then obviously the big one is the Israeli-Palestinian peace movement. These, taking, I guess, just in general, these three issues, I'd be interested in some of your thoughts. One, in terms of a potential Biden administration, how they might prioritize these three things in the context of, again, either rekindling some other multinational relationships or pursuing perhaps more, easy, not to say that all of these have their complexities, but more easily achieved, smaller victories on the way to something larger like an Israeli-Palestinian peace process. And in your respective comments, also feel free to kind of, we've all sat through now 6 speakers, to the extent you'd like to respond to some of the other things you've heard respectively. And I'll start, I guess, in order with Mr. Furziger, if you have any sort of general comments or feelings on that.
Sure, thanks, Jason. Wow, that was a marathon. So to digest it all, I think what I have seen over the last 4 years is an incredible era of disruption, of slaughtering the sacred cows, of even somebody like Martin Indyk, who was the high priest of the peace process, saying I was wrong, or I really may have missed some pieces, and whether it's instead of inside out, outside in, it has shaken things up. So does that mean that Trump should continue to pursue his course? I worry about where this extends to, and I think it could be that he has accomplished a mission, done some really heavy lifting, and that now it could be a good thing for calmer heads to prevail. It's possible that giving Biden a chance and his crew that maybe might be wizened a bit from the enthusiasm of the past, to bring things together, to synthesize the approaches of the past. As I said before, it is unprecedented to have the UAE, perhaps Saudi Arabia, at the table. Whether I've always thought that there was some effort, and you saw it, 20 years ago in Oslo, to clobber Arafat into submission. That happened to some extent after the Gulf War in '93 with Oslo, and I think that there is going to be some sort of effort that includes the actors in the Gulf to work with a new Palestinian leadership post Abbas. There are a number of people who are being mooted. One of the interesting players it actually lives in the UAE and in Abu Dhabi. There is an interesting partnership between the UAE and a fellow named Mohammed Dahlan, who is really the nemesis of Abu Mazen, of Mahmoud Abbas. But there are new ideas that are challenging the old beliefs. And even when you think that the emphasis is away from Israel-Palestine, my gosh, it just kind of springs up and it's irresistible. So I think that's going to be with us for a while.
Mr. Halavi?
Yeah, one of my main takeaways from this very rich conversation, something that Professor Lara said just a few moments ago, which is that the Biden administration will likely be seeking to offer the Iranian regime some face-saving way to a modified deal. And that phrase, Professor Laris, is going to haunt my dreams for a long time to come. Because if I have to sum up exactly where I, as an Israeli, feel the Obama administration went disastrously wrong on the Iran deal, it was precisely there. And what I'm hoping for a vigorous UAE-Israeli public joint policy on Middle Eastern issues, that we can reach an agreement between us on flexibility on the Palestinian issue. I personally would welcome an American administration that sets certain limits on Israeli settlement building. I think that's long overdue in the last years. So on the one hand, dovishness on the Palestinian issue, and on the other hand, hard line on the Iran deal. And to make clear that this is a joint Arab-Israeli position, I think that could have the kind of strategic and moral credibility that I was trying to convey before.
Thank you. Dr. Schenzer?
Yeah, I want to echo my colleagues in just saying that this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation. And I think there have been some points of maybe minor disagreement, although I do hear really a lot of agreement amongst us. But to try to get to your question specifically about the Biden administration and the kind of three major themes that it might address, the Iran deal, Gulf unity, Israeli Palestinians, to me, it seems like, yes, first of all, this has been an era of disruption. These 4 years have been a remarkable shift away from traditional foreign policy. But I would also note, by the way, that I think it was kind of the natural successor of what we saw from the Obama administration. And I don't mean to be sort of overly critical of the Obama administration, although I took real issue with a lot of their foreign policy positions, primarily because they were a significant shift away from traditional American foreign policy. They were almost a 180 with Iran appeasing a regime like this. It was bound to create some backlash. Engaging with the Muslim Brotherhood in the way that it did during the Arab Spring, it was bound to create some backlash. So I think we're seeing a continuation of seeds that were sown during that time period. And so the questions that I ask right now when I think about where a Biden administration might go, I think it's particularly after a Trump administration that has really been marked by populism, by a certain transactional nature, and really to a certain extent a moving target in terms of what the policy has been. We've seen some shifts along the way that have been very difficult to predict until they happen. I think I'm putting that mildly when we talk about the Trump administration's foreign policy. So the things that I watch for now are populism within the Democratic Party. And by that, I mean the sort of progressive wing and how much of an influence it might have on the traditional foreign policy makers and the advisors that have joined the Biden campaign. This is a real X factor, I would say, with all of these kind of three major issues that you've identified. There is the question, and I forget who raised it, there is the question of legacy. I think it was either Yossi or Alberto that talked about Obama's legacy, in particular looking at the Iran nuclear deal as trying to go back and kind of preserve what Obama had created. This was, in fact, his signature foreign policy. So certainly there could be an effort to rebuild what has been taken down by the Trump administration, but also potentially an inclination to go farther. And it's this sort of whiplash, this kind of the whiplash effect that we're seeing here that concerns me, because you could see more appeasement, you could see more sanctions relief, you could see additional sunset clauses that could further endanger the region. And so I think this question of legacy looms large. And then I think there's just this broader question that I think all of us are wrestling with here in the US, which is the question of traditional foreign policy. It used to be that there was a move to the center as you got closer and closer to election time here in the United States, that you had people from both sides trying to poach the kind of blue dogs. So Democrats would try to poach those within the Republican Party that might lean a little bit liberal in certain places, and vice versa. We're not seeing that at all. If anything, it's getting harder and harder to discern where that middle ground is in American foreign policy. And by the way, with foreign policy, it used to be the easier thing. Democrats and Republicans, especially as related to the Cold War, really didn't disagree on much. They would, kind of quibble on the margins. So there is a question now of where that center of gravity is, and in fact, whether Biden still wants to own that. Traditionally, I think he has stood in that place, but there are now extenuating circumstances. There's kind of a radicalized left, a progressive left, that could have a real bearing on some of these decisions that he may have to make. And so those are the things that I'm watching now.
Dr. Speckar, would you like to make any comment?
Yeah, I would just really second that, what Jonathan just said about populism and the changes in our country and over the world on how people get their news. In the past, when I was growing up, we all watched Walter Cronkite. Does that bring some memories back for any of you? And we had the same news, we lived in the same reality, or same perceived reality. But now we see that people can go to a dinner party, and depending on if they're watching CNN or Fox News, that they see things completely differently, and that we have polarities in our country. And, we did have this comment from Trump about the Proud Boys, and we did have the attempt to kidnap and I think kill the governor of Michigan. I think we're going to see more extremism all around the world from when we have these polarities from whichever group feels that it's not being heard. And I don't know the solution to how do we get back to that middle ground, but it's definitely going to affect how we do foreign policy, because it can create the inability to work well together across the aisle. And we've seen that for the last years, but I don't think it was just, I think that Trump was a result of that, actually, that he got elected and that he got the nomination. So I can't say that he's the cause of it, but it's something disturbing. Also, I would say we have to look at these misinformation actors. Right now we're looking at Russia and China playing all kinds of games in our electoral process, and things going out over Facebook and other ways of directly influencing the behavior of voters. And this is something that we're going to see more of, and it is also going to affect who gets elected, how they get elected, and it's a malign influence in our system. We've seen the same in Europe. And it's troubling. So that's what I would say. And going back to the Palestinians, I'm not sure if we'll ever see a two-state deal. I don't know.
Thank you. Ambassador Fernandez, would you like to make any comments?
Yeah, just briefly, in order not to talk about something that others have already talked about, I think there are a couple of interesting things. As I've said and others have said, I think there's a limited bandwidth on the region. There'll be temptations for deals and stuff like that. Aside from Iran, there's just not a lot of ability on a lot of things, especially at the beginning. However, I think there are two things which, in the broader scheme of things for the United States, may be minor, but for the region may be much more significant, especially in a Biden administration. Number one, I think the risk of, and it's in the Biden foreign policy plan, this idea of democracy promotion. It's quite possible that we could see kind of back to the future and kind of a return to democracy promotion of some sort, which will almost inevitably, if done by a Biden administration, be connected with political Islam. So I think that's there. It's not a huge issue. I mean, for people in the region, it's a huge issue. But in the larger scheme of things for the U.S., it's not one of the big ticket items, but I think it would be there. The second thing I think which has to kind of fall out, and this is true for the Middle East, but it's also true for the world as well, is whether the strange symbiotic relationship that we're seeing now, last week, the last few weeks, between the political left and tech monopolies. Dr. Speckart talked about disinformation and misinformation. Many people see that the rising tide for this is actually not on the right. The future is not Proud Boys. The future is academic and social media leftism run rampant over the world, including the Middle East. Thanks.
Thank you, Alberto. Professor Lares, I'll allow you to comment.
Yeah, just briefly. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but when you talk about more extremism, and then, that shocked me. I hope not. You are right, of course, that Trump is not the cause, but I think Trump has so much escalated it and made it worse. So I think if there is a more sober leader in the White House, simply more normal, more predictable, nothing visionary. We don't expect anything great or grand, but simply more normal and not as extreme in that kind of rhetorical, but also in some other ways which we identify with Trump. I think that will have a trickle-down effect. So I hope that, or I'm so optimistic to believe that extremism will actually be curtailed when we have that better model in the White House. Talking for the Europeans, for example, there is a total striving or wish for American leadership, if they would only take it in a sensible, benign, realistic, normal way. And I think, that is also the case in other parts of the world, at least in some countries in the Middle East, certainly also in South America. So I hope that, once Trump and his administration is out of the way, that it wouldn't lead to more extremism, but that gradually extremism actually comes down to a more normal measure, whatever more normal measure is. I know, maybe I'm too optimistic. And secondly, what we haven't really overlooked perhaps a little is Biden's personality. He comes across, and he of course runs on that, being a decent man, being a great normal person, simply decent with a good character and so on. So could he then really continue a very unholy alliance with Saudi Arabia when everyone knows about Khashoggi? Would that not disqualify Biden immediately in the eyes of many people who have voted for him? Could he continue with the war in Yemen and give American assistance, at least indirectly, on that basis? And also with Netanyahu, I think there is not much love lost for Netanyahu in many parts of the United States. So could Biden really have a chummy relationship with Netanyahu or develop one? and with other people, you know, so the Kushner effect, who just went around and was on extremely good terms with the most horrible people in the world. I think Biden couldn't do that. It would really undermine his total credibility, and also the people who will work for him. I don't think they would share that idea that you can deal with strongmen or autocrats only because they happen to be in a strategically positioned country. So I think that kind of more personal factor we should keep in mind. Maybe I'm too optimistic, who knows?
Thank you, Professor Laris. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our hour here. I'd like to once again thank all of our speakers today. It's been a wonderful conversation. Really thank you, and it's been an honor to serve as the moderator today. Before we formally conclude, I wanted to make everyone aware of the next E-Symposium that will be hosted by Trends. It'll take place Tuesday, November 10th, at the same time as this evening's event at 7 p.m. UAE time, and it's entitled Brotherhood in the Media, Between Promotion of Ideology and Serving Political Project. And this event will be a part of the Trends first annual Political Islam E-Forum under the title Path to Caliphate, The Truth Behind Muslim Brotherhood Project. So I ask you all to keep that on your calendar. And with that, I will go ahead and conclude today's event, and thank you all for participating.